So Dr. Berta Avila is a professor in the College of Education at Sacramento State. She received her doctorate in International and Multicultural Education in the School of Education at the University of San Francisco. She majored in Chicanx Studies from the University of California, Davis, and pursued an MA in Education and a teaching credential from Claremont Graduate University. Currently, Dr. Berta Avila teaches courses on curriculum development and social political foundations in education. Dr. Berta Avila is active in testifying at the Capitol and or other venues with respect to access and equity in education for English language learners. Sorry, I lost my spot there. Students of color and other marginalized communities. In addition, Dr. Berta Avila pursues her scholarly work within the areas of participatory action research, critical pedagogy, social justice education, and Chicanx educators in the field, in collaboration with Dr. Julie Figueroa and Dr. Anita Tijerina Rivilla, an edited volume titled Marching Students, Chicano Activism in Education, 1968 to the Present, was released in the spring of 2011. With that said, we are going to go ahead and invite Dr. Berta Avila to the floor.
All right, so how are we doing? Good. I've been trying to take deep breaths right now just because on our campus we're in orientations as well. So I think 12:20, I said, all right, everybody, I gotta go. And I jetted over here, and Martin calls me, you close by? I'm on 12, I'm about to make a right, so we're good. But I recognize some of you from past presentations, so I'm really happy to be here with all of you. And I'm going to be presenting today on cultural assets and racialization of post-secondary education. But also, I'm very honored to be with the panel, also presenting. Louis, go way back, and just being with everybody. So I want to thank Martin and everyone for inviting me today here. My approach to this talk, I feel like I have to lean against something, kind of be like a little more relaxed. My approach to this talk is going to be to advocate the following. One, for us to really be thinking about centering the dialogue and analysis of racism or racialization of post-secondary education. Oftentimes when we're thinking about Hispanic serving institutions, and I won't get into why I have a problem just even utilizing the word Hispanic, but it's okay, that's another session. But a lot of times many schools will, or institutions, look at just that designation as we're meeting our criteria for diversity, inclusion, etc., but really often evade the discussion that often we have to have, which is that unpacking of racism and the racialization of our students in institutions. Also, I want to think about our role as faculty, staff, students, if there's students here, towards transformational resistance. So naming this centering of racism, but then from there transitioning to looking at transformational resistance by amplifying what YOSSO talks about, the community cultural wealth, cultural assets of our students and even ourselves. And some of you that I've worked with before in the past, I've talked about, we also have to look at what are the cultural assets that we bring to the communities that we are working with and be able to engage in that way. And then finally, really looking at how we reflect on that for sustainability. Because we can continue this work, but if there's not constant acts of reflection and intentional reflection for the work that we do and how do we sustain ourselves to continue critical dialogues, to have individuals that we feel are not only our allies, but also there with us to interrupt and disrupt inequities, then this work can become very difficult to do, especially if we're being intentional with looking for access and equity and justice. I want to share that as I transition through this PowerPoint, it's not very long because we only got 20 minutes, but I'm trying to do something different, which is I'm going to show images versus just text to demonstrate what I'm talking about, all right? But this is some text right here, so, but it's a quote. It's from Bonilla Silva. Dominant racial frames therefore provide the intellectual roadmap used by rulers to navigate the always rocky road of domination. So if we're not real clear that there is a narrative that can truly influence us, then we will find ourselves in the act of perpetuating the very narratives and the racialization that occurs to our students without realizing that we're doing it. And so when we're thinking about this, I just want to share a short narrative of my own experience in graduate school. I did not go to a Hispanic serving institution, but I definitely went to an institution that touted itself in being progressive, right? And when I was at that institution, like many, you have your students doing presentations, what have you. And I was doing a presentation on ethnic studies and Chicano studies and the importance of that, and we're still fighting for it, but the importance of that being institutionalized at K through 12 high schools and universities, et cetera. So we have them, but they're not, consistent throughout the state, especially at the K through 12 section. And as I was giving my dialogue and talk, I was really honing in on issues of race and racism, and then the intersectionalities of that with class, gender, identification, and so forth. When I was done, just to make a long story short, one of the professors, another professor, because there were several professors there, and a classmate said, so I'm wondering if you can just get away from talking about racism and race and just hone in on class, right? So not to say, side note for myself, not to say that class is not important, but race and racism is the elephant in the room that we never want to unpack and discuss, because it brings back, for many, not only historically, but in contemporary, the historical contextual situations that we're not willing to unpack because of what that means or what people feel or where they think we're going with that or what we think we're insinuating, right? So from that moment, I realized the fear that individuals had, and if we didn't begin to have those discussions on the racialization of our students, racialization of our own realities as faculty of color or from different backgrounds, then we were never going to really get to the core of unpacking why we have inequities, whether they're conscious, subliminal, or done with intention. So racializing race as a historical past construct, evading, therefore silencing from the onset the analysis and individualizing it. So making racism, that's your issue. That's not a systemic issue that we need to talk about. It's just your experience, and that's very dangerous. So when we're thinking about systemic racism specifically, right, and how that racializes our students, individualizing it holds no accountability to the systemic structures that create racialized inequities for indigenous students, for students of color, and for the students that we're speaking to about today, Chicanx, Latinx students. And then also as well to the experiences of faculty of color and faculty in general that are on this journey. So in turn, there has to be a critique of domination, social power, and analysis of power relations necessary to counter the higher education institutions' perpetuation of the stratification of political, social, and economic systemic structures. So as individuals, as faculty, students, staff at this institution, we become implicated to this structure by reproducing social inequalities through whose culture's knowledge is valued and privileged, right? So we can have a Hispanic serving institution, but if we don't have those discussions about whose culture is valued, what is valued, then we will continue to perpetuate that. So it contributes to the marginalization of students of color and promotes this myth that many of you are familiar with, this myth of meritocracy, that we will be able to succeed as long as we try hard enough, but not dealing with what we're dealing with at high extremes right now, which is, and in our face, which is white supremacy. And this becomes even more problematic if we view our roles, especially within a Hispanic serving institution, as neutral, because neutrality does not exist in this context at all. So why must we question this? Like, why must we question the systemic structures that are in place, the evading of racism, the racialization of it, and its formation to systemic racism and its implication in policies and procedures, and even how we talk how we teach and see our students, we must question because of the historical framing. Historically into present day, these racial narratives, which is how these racializations come to be, have formalized to justify the racialization of communities and eventually proposing like a neoliberal laws and policies on institutions. So these myths become normalized as is through the white imaginative. And the white imaginative seeks to normalize a world where people of color, particularly Chicanx, Latinx communities, have been racialized and minoritized as inferior to people racialized as white. So this has become systemic and integral into the framework of the US context. And ultimately, the latter framing attempts to justify an ideal humanity looks like based on the universality of white standards and biases. So as a result, this work to perpetuate racism as invisible, right? Racism doesn't exist. And therefore normalizing social spaces in a way that perpetuates white power and privileges while making it look that that's not what's happening. And making us believe that the issues of racism are being addressed when really it's being masked and not being addressed. So perpetuating color blindness and in education is positioning that to evade race and culture, context, and purpose. So it's there to, and has punitive disparities of these ideologies. So how does a community get socialized to believe that racism doesn't exist even within our institutions? By consistently, like I mentioned earlier, presenting the illusion that race and whiteness is being addressed while reinforcing racism. And this is what I was talking about earlier. The new racism is to deny that racism exists. Bill Maher, I can never say his name, but he quotes this, but really we're talking about at the essence Sylvia Bonilla's work that I mentioned earlier. So as simplistic as this quote may seem, that racism doesn't exist and doesn't impact like how we think about what we're doing and how we're doing it, it's also really at the core of how we as an institution perpetuate deficit framing, especially of our students and families based on these racialized ideologies. As a result, practices are utilized in limiting via a banking method where we believe our students are coming with no knowledge or experience at all, and that our job is to just fill that vessel because it's empty. Some of you might have known or know the work of Paulo Freire, right? And so coming from that work and others that have built on him. So then that in turn, what that does is plays into the stratification structure of access, resources, and mobility, because that also influences how you're seeing the students. Do you see them as one that has success? Do you see them as one that doesn't? So having to really question your own implicit biases that can come to the forefront. And it situates particularly Chicana Latinx students in your classroom as deficient and then are dismissed, versus, which I'll talk about in a little bit, looking at the cultural assets that they bring. So the ramifications of the latter are real and impact not only at an individual level, but systemically. And the bold disruption, decentering of whiteness and having the discussions on racism has to be intentional in order to amplify the knowledge base that our students bring forth. So YOSSO comes to us with a way in how we can do this. And with some of you, I have talked about this already, by really naming what I've been talking about. And I'm sorry for spending some time on that, but it's really important, especially in our time, in the national context in which we're in, right? To really unpack the notion of racism and white supremacy and the influences of that, because we've done years of evading that conversation and the consequences have been detrimental, right? And we can't get to what Yosso's talking about, really looking, and what actually Louis is going to be talking about later on about what our students bring and the leadership skills that they bring if we can't name first what is being institutionalized to not have them be successful. And then from there, being able to really look at what is that cultural wealth that they bring. So my argument is, or my point is that, and of course this doesn't have to happen first and second, it's not sequential in that way, but simultaneously, like ebb and flows of how society works, that we have these multiple discussions of looking at what are the policies and institutional structures that we are blind to, or excuse that language, that we cannot, we're being evaded from really looking at intentionally, while simultaneously understanding who our students are. And YOSSO talks about 6 different assets, and obviously there's more that we could add to this, but 6 assets are really important for us to think about versus framing our students from a deficit lens that they don't speak English, hypothetically, right? They're not coming from backgrounds with families and resources, hypothetically. They don't have the experiences or the preparation. Instead of coming from that lens, looking at an aspirational wealth that they bring. So maintaining what are the hopes and dreams for the future that they have for themselves, right? And helping them also think about how to navigate that with the barriers, but not losing those hopes and dreams. What are the linguistic talents that they bring, the wealth that they bring linguistically, intellectually, social skills, attaining through communicative experiences in more than one language? So she gave me the 5-minute thing. There we go, right? So instead of saying they're not, when I used to teach high school, a student would come in and say, maestra, casi no entiendo nada de inglés. And I'm like, I hardly know anything of English, a little bit of English. And I'll be like, you know, sister, brother, like you're learning a second language or you're learning a third language. That's an asset, right? That's something powerful. What's the familial wealth that they bring, the knowledge nurtured amongst their family, their communities that has influenced and shaped their lives? The social, the networks, the people, the community and resources that are providing them the skills to be able to navigate in their experiences. Building on that navigational skills to move through schools. Are you the individuals that are going to help give them the information they need to be able to push forward? And then sometimes we see resistance as being, what's the word I'm looking for? As being something that is, because I was told this one time, that I was very confrontational, right? And I am, I'm not gonna lie. But focused confrontation. But resistance is also very powerful because students are letting you know, and resistance doesn't mean like, hey, you know, like this, but resistance in how they might challenge you, question you. That's a skill to have, right? As far as what they're bringing to the table, to not just say, I'm just going to believe everything you're telling me. So with that, right, with that notion, I'm sorry, I got to turn my page real quick here. And I think I'll probably only have like 3 minutes. We as educators, educators of color, educators that are allies in this room, must recognize the structural racial inequalities and strive to strategically counter through our curriculum, using YOSSO's work and other work, foster that community inside and out, build those relationships with the family and the advocacy that it needs on behalf of the students to counter these racist practices. And the community cultural wealth that you bring to the table has to be amplified to also reframe the deficit narrative grounded in white supremacy. So it's critical to understand the latter, but know that schools and your role as educators can act as sites of resistance, as well as posit that your education, like I mentioned earlier, your role as educators is political. Teachers' decisions or your decisions as faculty, as staff, shape the socio-political context. And like I was saying, no, actually I think I was telling this to my students, sorry, I'm like 2 different places, but no neutrality exists. So the goal is not to reproduce, but rather have a transformative environment. And here's where I want to end with that. FARIMA POUR-KHORSHID, she talks about, well, I named it this way. She doesn't name it this way, but I named it 3 points of intersection and sustainability. And she talks about testimonials, critical comrades, and fugitizing, right? And what she says is that in order to be able to continue to have these difficult conversations that exist around racialization and racism, and simultaneously have the discussions of how am I going to interrupt what can perpetuate that and focus on the wealth of my students, and through my pedagogy, through the environment I foster, through the roles and positions I take on at the university. She's saying we have to have those moments of testimonio. We have to have those moments as a collective to tell our stories to one another, to share our experiences with one another, not only as our experiences through our own educational experiences and personal experiences in life, but what we are going through being part of institutions, having those moments of collectives to share. This happened to me yesterday. Here's how I engaged with it. What do you all think? And having those opportunities. Then she said it's critical that in those spaces that you begin to formalize yourselves or see yourselves as critical comrades with one another. Individuals that you trust with, that you are building relationship and community with, to interrupt together collectively, because as a fish with sharks, you're going to be eaten, right? Not to say that that's what's going to happen here, but but that collectively you stand in solidarity, or you are in solidarity with one another to disrupt this, and you're doing it together. And then she was talking about fugitizing and saying that sometimes that it's critical to have, I'm going to just say real quickly, and I know I got like maybe 30 seconds left, right? But I'm going to say real quickly, these types of professional development or professional learning experiences where we're actually talking about race and racism, racialization, or the different topics that I know you've all been having through these past couple of years is not seen everywhere, right? And so what she was talking about is that these kind of conversations has to happen in these spaces, but often they don't. So it's actually really cool that you are doing this. But if you're in spaces that it's not happening, then you have to, with the collective, through your sharing of each other and building that relationship, and through being critical comrades, be able to continue your own professional learning outside of out of the institution while you're in the institution, if your institution is not moving towards this direction, right? So that is critical. So this work can be one that will take our spirit and our energy because we are dedicated to it. But it's not going to do us any good if we are not sustained and be able to be there in a context of sustainability for our students and for ourselves and for each other. So I think I made it. All right, thank you very much.